Would you open your Bibles once again to Mark chapter 4? That's Mark chapter 4. We're continuing our study in the Gospel of Mark. And we've been here for a few months now. But before we dive into it, actually, there's one quick announcement that I'd forgotten to make earlier. And that is of a men's conference coming up, hosted by LABTS, Los Angeles Baptist Theological Seminary. And it's called Spiritually Healthy Men. It's on Saturday, January 25th, from 7:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Any men that are interested, we strongly encourage anyone, whether you're a member or not. It'll be a great time to hear the word from some very gifted pastors and teachers in the area. A bunch of us at the leadership level from the church are going, and we'd love to see you there. We'll make carpool arrangements. Yes. So you can register online directly, and it'll actually be cheaper, I think, if you register online at www.eventbrite.com, and we can email you the exact instructions if you reach out to the office here to make sure you get that discount. Otherwise, it's $20 at the door. So you'll save a few bucks if you register online. Again, that's Saturday, January 25th. Look forward to seeing you men there. So now we turn to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4. The moment we've been waiting for, actually, if you look at the background slide, right, that famous picture, Jesus on a boat in stormy seas. So follow along with me as I read from verses 35 through 41. So on that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were with him, and a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" In October 1991, the Andrea Gale fishing boat set out sail from Gloucester, Massachusetts, with a 6-man crew for a month-long expedition, longline fishing for swordfish. The boat was a 12-year-old vessel, 70 feet long, led by an experienced captain, Frank. They called him Billy Tyne. And Tyne had a reputation as a fearless captain in his 10 years as a professional fisherman. He had survived several treacherous storms. And one of his crewmen, the first mate, David Sullivan, actually a last-minute replacement, he also was a local hero. See, he had actually saved the lives of his entire crew one bitter January cold evening 2 years earlier. The ship was unexpectedly taking in water out of nowhere, and he heroically pulled himself across the rope to his sister ship and returned with help just in time to save his crewmen. But this time, on the Andrea Gale, was different. This fishing expedition would be one for the history books. Because days after they set sail from the harbor and were already 500 miles into the Atlantic, meteorologists noticed something strange in the waters. They noticed something strange on their radars. Something so rare that it only happens once a century. 3 separate storms that were growing and moving into a head-on collision off the coast of New England. And this is why Bob Case, a meteorologist at the Boston branch of the National Weather Service, called it the perfect storm. Because it absolutely couldn't have been worse. It was the perfect set of circumstances to create the perfect scenario for the most devastating storm possible, the perfect storm. But before the storm wreaked havoc on the East Coast, from Nova Scotia to Florida, causing over $500 million in damages. It was raging in the middle of the ocean, 500 miles off the coast. And the 6 men aboard the Andrea Gale found themselves right in the heart of it. Now, depending on the conditions and the amount of catch, the crew were usually out for a month at a time, according to the boat's owner, Robert Brown. But after Brown hadn't heard from them for 3 days, an unusually long time, worry started to set in. A Maine fishing boat captain, Linda Greenlaw, was the last person to speak with her sister ship, the Andrea Gale, and she said her last conversation was typical. She wanted a weather report, Tyne wanted a fishing report. They exchanged a cordial, calm, and even joking kind of a conversation with Tyne. And after that, nothing. Silence. No distress calls, no word, no answers as to how or if the ship went down. Nothing. Ever. The Coast Guard began an extensive search, but after 10 days without any success, they called it off. The boat, the crewmen were never found. And Jerry Lynn Amerheim, the mother-in-law of Dale Murphy, one of the crewmen, says that the horrors of losing a loved one at sea never ends. It never ended for her. And in an interview years later, she said, "I never stopped thinking about Murph. His death is not in the past for me." And she continues to talk about how hard it was for her to read the details about how the men likely died in the midst of towering waves crashing them in from all angles. And the details she's talking about are mentioned in a book that came out actually a few years later called The Perfect Storm. She says, "We don't know the fright they felt." And she's right, isn't she? I mean, there are a few things more terrifying than being trapped in the middle of an ocean on a 70-foot boat with nothing but water in the horizon, everywhere you look, and 100-foot waves crashing in around you. Can you imagine the hopelessness, the loneliness in that moment? Can you imagine the helplessness, knowing there's absolutely nothing you can do to save your life and the lives of those around you? This is a terrifying, crippling kind of fear of certain death by the untamable forces of nature that you have absolutely no control of. You can't do anything. But can I suggest something to you this morning? Can I suggest to you that the disciples on the boat with Jesus in this storm here in Mark 4 experienced this same kind of terror of nature? Can I suggest to you that though the disciples had just this kind of crippling fear and helplessness overwhelming them on the boat, they faced someone actually, far more terrifying than the storm? I'm talking about the one who calmed the storm, the one who created the storm, actually, the one who created all things and controls all things by his sovereign power and his word, including nature, the Son of God, Jesus. And though the disciples experienced the terrifying power of nature, they end up even more terrified of the one who they've seen just control that nature by speaking to it, Jesus. And they ask themselves a question. The most important question that any human being, that you, that me, and everyone in the world could ever ask themselves. Who then is this? Who then is this Jesus? This Jesus that is so powerful that he even controls the elements, the sea, the winds, nature. Because how you answer that question, how anyone answers that question, is the only thing that matters in eternity. And so we pick up the story in verse 35. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, let us go to the other side. So Jesus has been teaching all day by the Sea of Galilee, teaching the crowds in parables and privately explaining their meaning to his disciples, the insiders, those inside God's kingdom. We've been seeing that. And Mark's language implies that Jesus spoke many more parables, but for Mark's purposes here, he only recorded 4, right? The sower, the lamp, the seed, and the mustard seed. And on that day, the same day according to Mark, in the evening, Jesus says, let us go across to the other side. Who's us? Well, the disciples, the 12, and presumably the others to whom Jesus has granted to know the secrets of the kingdom of God in verses 10 to 12. The ones whom he's been giving the private parable explanations to in verses 33 and 34, just before. The ones who hear Jesus, and the ones who then follow Jesus. Verse 36. And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat just as he was. And other boats were with him. So his disciples left the crowd behind. The crowd, those who weren't interested in truly hearing and truly following Jesus. And they took him, speaking of Jesus, with them in the boat, it says. Just as he was. Which is just probably Mark saying that they took him to go to the other side in the boat he was already in and had been teaching from all day long. He used the boat as a kind of floating pulpit. And Jesus always operated with a sense of urgency in his ministry. The disciples would have known that by now, so they immediately headed for the other side without wasting time going back to the shore to prepare. And especially knowing that if they went back to the shore, the crowds would have just continued jostling Jesus just to get a piece of his healing power. So they went straight, headed for the other side. And he says the other boats were with him, probably carrying those others that were also around Jesus, following Jesus beyond just those 12 that were with him in his boat. And you'll notice about Mark's narration of this story, he includes a lot of these seemingly insignificant details that Matthew and Luke don't. Which more than anything are all the earmarks of an oral story, a story which he had heard time and time again from Peter, right? Mark's gospel is the memoirs of Peter. In verse 35, he says, on that day. Verse 35, when evening had come. Verse 36, just as he was, the disciples took him. Verse 36, and other boats were with him. And in verse 38, Jesus was asleep on the cushion. And so individually, these details seem insignificant. But when you read the story as a whole, they bring it to life. Because only someone who was there, only an eyewitness could have known, could have remembered these vivid details, that Jesus was asleep on the cushion. Only Peter, Mark's mentor and friend in Rome, could have told him those things. And so they set sail from the western bank of the sea, Capernaum, to the eastern, Gentile, populated bank of the sea. Verse 37, and a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat so that the boat was already filling. So the geography of the Sea of Galilee provided all the right ingredients from nature necessary to produce instant, sudden storms. Perfect storms. It was located in a basin about 700 feet below sea level, and it was surrounded by hills on all sides. So the wind carries the cooler air down from the hills onto the lake, which then collides with the warmer air coming from the lake's surface, and voila, you have the conditions for a treacherous squall. And at night and early in the morning, the sea was known for being calm, quiet. But when storms do come during those times, they're deadly dangerous. And just such a storm arises on that evening, Mark says, a great windstorm, a furious squall, a hurricane even in the original. This is not a little bit of current, a couple of 3-4 foot high waves at the splash pool we're talking about here. This is an all-out storm with waves as big as 10 to 15 feet crashing in from all sides. And they have to be that big in order to sink a 26.5-foot long, 7.5-foot wide, and 4.5-foot high standard-sized fishing boat in the Sea of Galilee. They can't be some little bitty waves. This wasn't a dinky little canoe that they were using to get on the other side. No, this was a professional fishing boat built to withstand the elements, the wind, and the stormy seas of Galilee. And even the disciples were used to storms, actually. At least the 4 fishermen among them, right? Peter, Andrew, James, and John. So how do they respond to this storm? Verse 38, but he, speaking of Jesus, was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing? So the 4 in particular were seasoned fishermen who'd seen and survived their fair of severe storms. But they know there's something different about this storm. They knew that this time they weren't going to come out of it alive. They weren't going to make it to the other side alive. So they say, Jesus, don't you care that we're about to die? Actually, he's just a teacher to them. They call him teacher, rabbi. They still don't know who he really is. Teacher, don't you care about us? That our lives are about to flash before our eyes? What kind of question is that? Out of all the questions in the world in this moment that they could have asked Jesus, panicking, that's what you want to ask him? And actually accuse him of? Teacher, are we going to make it to the other side? Teacher, we've seen you do some miraculous things. Are you going to pull through for us this time? Teacher, what are we going to do? No. Instead, they attack his character with this ridiculously false, loaded question. Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing? Because if you cared about us at all, in the slightest, you'd do something about it. Instead, you're fast asleep, sleeping like a baby on the cushion. How would Jesus have responded had he answered that question? What would Jesus have said to them? How long have you been with me now, Peter, Andrew, James, John, and the rest of you? A year and a half, 2 years? Haven't I taken care of you every single day since I called you to follow me? Haven't I provided you a meal, enough food to eat every single day for 2 years? Haven't I provided you a place to sleep and safety? Not once have your lives ever been in danger this entire time. And I've made sure to take care of you and your every need because I care. And now you're going to question whether or not I actually really care? No, if there's one thing, just one thing, at the very least, you should know about me by now, it's that I care. I care about you. We don't know who exactly was the one asking the question, but my hunch is Peter, the undisputed spokesman and leader of the 12 in the Gospels. He's impulsive, rash, blurts out the first thing that comes to his mind, irrational things, something just like this, calling into question Jesus' care and affection for him and the others in the heat of the moment when he knows better. And they're calling out Jesus' care into question because he's sleeping, by the way. Because he's sleeping. Is he sleeping because in his humanity he's physically exhausted from all the preaching of the gospel of God and the healing and the casting out of the demons day and night? Is he sleeping with the peaceful serenity that only God could have in the middle of chaos and crisis in a life or death situation? I think it's both. Because remember, Jesus is truly a man, so he did get tired And he did need rest just like the rest of us. But he's also truly God. And God alone can sleep and rest peacefully in the middle of a storm. And by the way, this is the only place in the Gospels that we're told anything about Jesus sleeping. The only place. Did you know that? And the irony of the only time the gospel writers decide to tell us anything about Jesus sleeping is during a storm. Can't that be more striking? Isn't their intention any more obvious? They're trying to tell us something here. And what they're trying to tell us, what Mark's setting us up for, is the stark contrast between Jesus' perfect trust in God and the disciples' complete fear of death. Between Jesus' perfect trust in God and the disciples' lack of trust in Jesus' word, actually. Remember what he had just said in verse 35? Let us go across to the other side. He didn't say, let me. Let us go across to the other side. And that wasn't a suggestion. No, in the original, it's more of a command, actually. It's a hortative. All of us together, let's go, grab your things, we're going to the other side. And if Jesus says something, it's going to happen. He's going to do what he says, because he always does what he says and never fails in doing anything he says he'll do. But the disciples are panicking. And they're panicking with the fear of impending death. And it's the kind of panic that only a fear of death can produce. So all logic, all reason, all clear thinking, all remembering what Jesus has said and done and knowing what he can do, which could otherwise cause them to have peace and be still and trust in him, is gone. It's out the window. Overboard for them, actually. So what does Jesus do? Verse 39. And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He rises up off the cushion, and he speaks to the wind and the sea. Now, just imagine yourselves in the disciples' shoes here, sandals, for a minute, on that boat. Imagine you're the brazen, outspoken Peter, and you're scared to death in the middle of the worst storm you'd ever seen in your extensive career as a fisherman on the Sea of Galilee. And suddenly, Jesus, this teacher, rises up and he speaks to the wind and sea, and simultaneously, instantly, they come to an immediate halt, and the water's surface is perfectly still. Can you just think about that for a second? Imagine seeing Jesus speak to the elements, to the wind, to the sea. We're talking about inanimate objects here, inanimate nature, as though they're a person, as though they can listen and hear. And then they do exactly as he says, exactly when he says it. Be still now. This is not a cheap parlor trick, where Jesus waits around 40 minutes for the storms because they come and go quickly then. And then suddenly, towards the end of the 45 minutes, he already sees it kind of coming to a halt, and then he just quickly speaks, and he takes the disciples for fools. This is not that. This is immediate. This is instantaneous. Nor is it like the crowds of Christians and Muslims that were gathered together last week in Australia to pray for the rain over the wildfires. That didn't work because they don't have the power over nature. No, he rebukes the wind and sea as he would a physical human being, and even a demonic being, actually, which we've seen him do. And the wind and sea stop immediately, in a split second, before the disciples can even blink. Verse 39, and there was a great calm. It wasn't just calm like it was before, steady sea, it was perfectly still. From chaos to order in the blink of an eye. Yeah, you can picture the disciples just standing there on the boat, stunned. Jaws dropped to the floor. But before they even have a chance to respond, to process what their eyes have just seen and witnessed, immediately after rebuking the wind and the sea, Jesus now finally turns his attention to them, to the ones who woke him up from his peaceful sleep, because they were scared to death, of death by drowning. Verse 40, he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" Think about the patience of Jesus here. The gentleness of Jesus. The tenderness of Jesus. He doesn't yell at them. He's not angry at them. He doesn't rebuke them like he does the wind and the sea. He simply looks at them in frustration. How many people have you seen me heal? At your house alone, Peter, that night? Hundreds? Thousands? How many demons have you seen me cast out of people? Remember the leper I cleansed? The crippled, the paralytic, the quadriplegic who now walks? The man with the withered hand who now has two good ones? Do you still not have faith in me? What more do I have to do so that you'll see me for who I really am? Even as the demons do, the Son of God. Have you that little faith, as Matthew records Jesus' reply to them in Matthew 8? And it is almost as though they had a little bit of faith, isn't it? Because at the first sign of danger, what do? They immediately run to Jesus for help. Almost as though, even though they were terrified for their lives, they knew he was the only one who could do something about it. They knew that. They probably didn't think he would do what he just did, speak to the wind and sea. That kind of power over nature is unthinkable. But they knew he could do something. They knew he had supernatural power. They'd seen it time and time again. And if we're honest, we do the same thing too, don't we, in the middle of a crisis situation? As believers? Don't we? We know that God promises to take care of our every need, just as he does the birds of the sky and the flowers of the fields. We have a little faith, but we still panic. Don't we? Oh, I don't know if I'm going to make it to my next paycheck. How am I going to pay my bills? Am I going to have enough food to feed my family? Lord, where are you in the storm of a marriage? I've had it up to here with my husband and I can't take it anymore. Save me. Save my marriage. Lord, my children are adults now and they want nothing to do with you. They're miserable, depressed, going through the storms of life on their own, and they're angry, bitter at everyone, bitter at you, at me, at life. And they have no idea how to navigate the storms of life that only you can. Because they won't believe. They won't hear. Where are you, Lord? Save them. And there is a sense in which to doubt, to demonstrate little faith, a lack of faith in the middle of storms in life is normal. It's human even among believers. But can I suggest to you the reason why that tends to happen to all of us? Why our proclivity in trials is always towards faithlessness instead of faithfulness? It's because we're consumed by what we're going through. We're consumed by the pain we're experiencing. We're consumed by the worry, the anxiety, the stress, the fear. And because we're consumed by all these things, we lose sight of the person behind the trial. The person whose purpose for us to go through this trial. The person who's with us in the midst of this trial. The person who carries us through this trial to the other side. The person who will rejoice and be brought much glory in the end when we stay faithful to him in this trial. Jesus. Jesus. You see, trials aren't about you, they're not about me. They're about him. About God. And Jesus. And focusing on him in the midst of the trial. Because he alone can take you through it. And that's what I've been trying to tell you here about this story that's so often told and even more often misunderstood. We love to teach our kids this story. It's probably one of the most famous and widely recognized stories about Jesus. Oh, did you hear the one about Jesus and the disciples on the boat in the storm? Yeah, Jesus is out on a boat with his disciples, and a great storm arises, and his disciples are very afraid, but Jesus calms the storm, and Jesus will calm the storm in your life too. Oh, wonderful. Look, it is true, and it is biblical, that Jesus can and does calm the storm in your life. But that's not the point of this passage at all. Actually, more than anything, it's the opposite, isn't it? The point of the passage is that Jesus causes the storm in your life. Or who do you think caused the storm here? Was it a random occurrence? Chance? Random selection? Mother Nature? Or did Jesus purposely bring about this storm, this trial, on his disciples all along from the beginning? What did he say in verse 35? In the evening, on that day, after a long day of teaching, let us go across to the other side. You think when he said that, he didn't know a storm was coming, at the very least? Being omniscient as God. Let me take it a step further. You think he not only knew the storm was coming, but he purposed for the storm to come? He created the storm? Look, if he has the power to stop the storm, you think he doesn't have the power to unleash it? Psalm 107 actually speaks about this, about God as the sovereign force who stirs up the storms in the sea that causes sailors to melt in fear. Verse 23, some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep. For he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They mounted up to heaven, and they went down to the depths. Their courage melted away in their evil plight. They reeled and staggered like drunken men, and they were at their wits' end. Then they cried to the Lord in their help, and he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. This is all over the Old Testament. Psalm 104, 106, Isaiah 50, Nahum 1. The Old Testament is replete with this kind of language about God as the controller and the sovereign over nature. So you're telling me that Jesus caused the storm to begin with and purposely told his disciples to bring him to the other side just so he could take them through it? Yes. Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Why? Why would Jesus do that to them? And the answer to that question comes from the disciples' question in verse 41. And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Jesus caused the storm and brought them through the storm so he could show them the terrifying reality of his power and of his glory. Jesus brought them through the storm so he could show them who he really is, his deity, his divinity, his godness, in a way that they could no longer deny. He didn't bring them through the storm merely just to show them that he could deliver them from it. He brought them through the storm to show them that he is Lord and he is sovereign even over nature. And they were scared to death because of it. Literally, it says they feared a great fear. And isn't it interesting that only now, at the end of the story, does Mark actually tell us that the disciples were scared? I mean, we know they were scared of the storm because they thought they were going to die and they were panicking. But Mark doesn't actually say they were scared of the storm. Not once. But now, at the end, so we don't miss his point, he says it twice. They feared a great fear because they knew the Old Testament. They knew the passages we just mentioned earlier, Psalm 107 and 106 and 104 and Nahum 4. They knew that only God possessed the kind of power over nature that they had just seen with their own eyes. Yes, they'd seen Jesus' power over disease and over demons, but there's something different about power over the forces of nature, isn't there? That are seemingly wild, untamable, chaotic, too powerful, too lofty for anyone to have sovereignty over. But now they've just seen, for the first time in Jesus' ministry, and for the first time in their lives, a man, from their perspective, Jesus, exercised total power over nature with a simple word. And they're petrified, shaking. If we could see their faces, they're probably white as ghosts, pale. And not from seasickness because of the stormy sea. No, they've just seen God, and they survived to tell the tale. Even if they don't know exactly how that's possible, how God can also be a man, the man standing in front of us right now, that we can see and touch and hear. We know God is spirit, not flesh. This doesn't make sense to us, yet we know that what we've just seen is only ever attributed to God in the Old Testament. So somehow and in some way, the man standing in front of us right now on this boat with us is God. There is no other explanation. And look, you can imagine how terrifying it is to be trapped in a raging storm at sea, on the brink of drowning. That is a terrifying death. But even more terrifying is to realize, for the first time, especially for them after 2 years with him, day and night, that you're standing in the presence of the Almighty Creator, Lord, Sovereign of the universe. That's almost an unbearable thought, knowing how sinful we are. But an even more unbearable thought is to be standing in the presence of this Almighty Creator, Lord, sovereign of the universe, awaiting judgment. Which brings us back now full circle to the question, to the title question of this message. The question we asked in the beginning. The disciples question among themselves after they've just witnessed this with their own eyes, the awesome, creative, controlling power over nature. Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? To you. Who is this Jesus who even the wind and the sea can't deny? To you. Is he just a teacher? A good teacher, a rabbi with good morals who tried to make society and the world around him a better place? Is he a madman? A lunatic? A nut job, out of his mind, like he was to his family, who in chapter 3 tried to stop him from continuing his ministry and finishing his work? Is he just a fake? A phony? A liar who's nothing more than a man? And all these stories we read about in the Gospels are nothing more than a collection of lies fabricated by his phony, false followers. Or is he the one who's going to give you everything you want? Health, wealth, happiness, success? Or is he Lord? Do you believe in him as Lord? Because only the Lord of the universe can do what he does, what he just did in controlling the elements in nature. So we know now that this story is not about us, or the disciples, for that matter, and now God can calm the storms in our lives. At least not primarily. We get that it's all about Jesus and his deity and his divine, awesome, terrifying power and glory, even over the natural world. We get that it's about going to him and focusing on him as Lord, as Savior and Sustainer through life storms in order to make it through the other side. We get it. Yet the disciples still didn't get it. They still didn't see it. As hard as it is to believe after this. And we're going to keep seeing their lack of faith and their lack of understanding just continue to escalate till it comes to a pinnacle, a climax in Mark's gospel. No, they are not the model of faithful discipleship. Jesus is. That's the point. In spite of what they've just been seeing Jesus do in the storm, in spite of everything they've already seen, the disciples will continue to show faithlessness, weakness, fear, panic, until after the cross, after they see Jesus the Christ in his resurrection glory. Then they'll finally see him, as Mark says they took him here in the boat, just as he is. And what was Jesus' example of discipleship? Faith so strong in his God that he was able to sleep through a deadly storm. Jesus, do you not care that we're perishing? The disciples said. Maybe Peter, the leader, said. Peter, to whom Jesus will later say, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man," in Mark 8:33. Peter, who ran away scared and trembling, denying Jesus 3 times before the rooster crows, twice after his arrest in Mark 14:30. What happened to Peter's faith after the cross? The early church is flourishing under the leadership of Peter, James, and John in Jerusalem. Countless numbers are being added. 3,000 men in one day, actually, after Peter boldly rises up and preaches his first sermon in Acts 2. And as with any new, rapidly growing movement, the powers that be, Rome, and particularly the Jews, the Judaizers, they increased their hostility and persecution of the Christians. And so by the time you get to Acts 12, Herod, the Jewish puppet king that was put in place by Rome, he just killed James, the brother of John, it says, to appease the Jews, and they were thrilled, bloodthirsty. And it says in order to please them, the religious elite, the Sanhedrin, the scribes, the Pharisees, he arrests Peter and throws him in prison. And on the very night of his impending trial and execution, before Herod, look what Acts 12, 6-7 says Peter was doing. Verse 6. Now when Herod was about to bring him out, on that very night, Peter was sleeping between two soldiers, bound with two chains, and sentries before the door were guarding the prison. And behold, an angel of the Lord stood next to him, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him, saying, "Get up quickly." And the chains fell off his hands. He was sleeping. In prison. Chained between two soldiers. Peacefully. Not a worry on his mind. Awaiting death. Fearlessly. Because after the cross, after the resurrection, Peter finally was able to see Jesus for who he was. God, Lord, Savior, King. His fear of Jesus on the boat had turned to love for Jesus, and that love turned to belief, and that belief turned to trust, and that trust turned to faith so strong that he was finally able to follow in the footsteps of Jesus and sleep in the middle of the storm. Pray with me.